Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning's episode of Executive Insights, The Sound of Success. Today, we'll be diving into podcast strategies for brand growth. I'm very excited to get into this topic about how brands can leverage podcasts, drive more meaningful connections with brands, and also focus on performance and attribution. But before we dive into the exciting content, I really want to introduce my exciting panel of guests today. Joining me is Haresh, Tilani, and Terence Chia, the co-creators of Yalla But. Haresh and Terence helm a thrice weekly podcast on current affairs and news, adding a touch of humor as they explore life in Singapore. The podcast quickly rose to fame for being one of the top local podcasts with more than 40,000 followers and 6 million streams across 600 plus episodes. From gold medalists to presidential candidates, Haresh and Terence have had all of the guests on their podcast. So good morning, Haresh, Terence, welcome.
Hello, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Excited to have you. Also joining me on the panel this morning is Kim. Kim Treasure is the founder and CEO of Audacia Audio. Kim's had a long journey in audio advertising from her days at Spotify, where she identified a gap in the market. And really what this did was birth Audacia. So Audacia is a global premium programmatic marketplace that focuses on premium audio solutions with attribution, creative measurement, and strategy. Good morning, Kim.
Morning. Thanks for having me, Lacey.
So excited to speak to the panelists on their views in terms of podcasting. But before we do, we really want to understand exactly who is in the room today. So we're going to start with a quick poll, if you like. So the first poll is, how often do you listen to podcasts? Is it daily, a few times a week, once a week, less than once a week, or I don't listen to podcasts at all? Let's just wait for the results to come in. Okay, the results are in. So it looks like daily, only 9%. A few times a week is 23%, once a week, 15%, less than once a week, 28%, and 26% of people in the room don't listen to podcasts at all. I'm quite surprised by that. But there you go. Interesting. Okay, so one more poll before we get into the content. Does your brand use podcast advertising currently? First, have you used it before? Yes, we're familiar with it. No, but we're interested to learn more, which I hope we are if we're here today. And no, it's not something we are considering. Okay, let's just give it a few more seconds to get the answers in. Okay, closing now. Okay, a 12% says, yes, we've used it before. 10% we're familiar with it. And I mean, that's encouraging for everyone on the panel. 62% says no, but we're interested to learn more, which is great. And 17% said no, it's not something we are considering. So hopefully we can change your opinions about that today. Okay, so before we speak to our guests about their expertise in the podcasting space, I just want to set the scene in terms of the size of the digital audio industry as a whole. Right? So if we look at the stats from 2024, there was over 1.5 billion digital audio listeners globally last year. Right? And the part that really impresses me is that's a 20% increase from 2023. So it really shows this is a huge growth medium. Besides listenership, we've also seen digital audio spend. The forecast is by 2027, it's going to be a $12.8 billion industry globally. Right? So there's no denying that in terms of listenership and advertising revenue, this is going to be a huge growth area. If we look a little bit closer to home, right, let's look at Singapore. So this data comes from Triton, which is one of the global SSPs for audio. And what we can see is the average Singaporean listens to 3 podcasts per week across Chinese, English, Malay, and other dialects. So it's certainly becoming an integral part of a Singaporean's life and week, right? And if we look at the next slide, Chai Fong, for me, we can look at the advertising space as a whole. So there was a 59% increase in programmatic advertising in audio in 2023 versus 2022. And for those of us that are in advertising and digital, that's a huge amount of growth compared to other mediums, right? And the undeniable fact that Singaporeans are consuming podcasts is really when we look at this stat here, 57 million podcast downloads in 2023. Right? So this is continuing to grow. Haresh and Terence, you have definitely benefited from this huge growth in listenership in podcasts and hype around this area. But I'm curious, obviously it's taken a lot of work to build what you've built with Yalla but what are some of the ways that you've engaged audiences and built your own community?
I think like the one thing that we realized with the podcast space, because we've actually been creating content online for a long time. We started off doing short form comedy videos with Ministry of Funny. With podcasts, we realized that the content is very important, but so is the relationship between the podcaster and the audience. So, I mean, there was a lot of trial and error. This was not the first iteration of our podcast, but as we did it, we realized that, I mean, one thing, for example, is making content that we want to listen to as the first part. And the second thing, which was surprising, was the more we share about ourselves. I mean, our podcast is about news and politics through comedy, but the more we share about ourselves, our personal lives, the deeper the connection with our listeners, which was something quite eye-opening for us, which is very different from short form video.
Yeah.
I've definitely noticed that. I've watched some of your podcasts and I see, before you dive into a political commentary or a topic, you share a lot about your families, your home life. So there's a big connection there, which is great. Yeah. I am curious, and I'm going to throw this one to Terence because I have been listening to a lot of your podcasts and you guys have a unique perspective on things in Singapore, right? Now, from a brand and advertiser perspective, in a world where increasingly brands are becoming more filtered in terms of wanting brand safe environments, maybe not wanting to be associated with certain social issues, how do you kind of straddle that between creating amazing content that engages with your community and audiences and offering a brand safe environment?
Sure. I mean, so it's actually baked into our brand. I mean, the name of our podcast is Yalla, which in Singapore, I mean, most people understand it as when you want to make a counterpoint to something someone else is saying. So the idea of thinking in a slightly more contrarian way or trying to see things from a different perspective is part of our brand and part of our edginess that we're trying to package for people out there. So, trying to do advertising friendly content, advertisers who come to us, actually most of the time they already do know what they're in for. Of course, there's still a bit of a dialogue about what we can or maybe that some no-go areas that they don't want to touch. There can be a dialogue about it, but for the most part, we find that the advertisers who come to us, they do want us to lean in on that edginess, on that slightly more provocative aspect of what we do. And in fact, it might be even in line with something that they're trying to push for their brand. For example, they want to talk about transparency, because their product deals in that space of transparency, or they want to do something related to, thinking out of the box. So for us, is if those values are aligned, it's the perfect fit. And I think advertisers will be, they see the long-term value in associating their brand with ours. And that's how we get around, making what you say slightly more provocative content but still making sure that we are advertiser friendly.
So what are the most common OB markers that you get from advertisers in terms of, any advertisers you've worked with?
I
No
mean,
swear
the
words.
swear words is one very clear one, and yeah, I mean, Haresh is very guilty of letting one slip every now and then.
Yeah.
But I think definitely when in Singapore, maybe less so these days, but politics. Every time we talk about politics on our podcast, people think, oh, that's kind of edgy. It's not something we want to go near. But in recent years, the people have become more engaged with politics, whether on TikTok, Instagram, or any other platform. So it's as long as you approach the topic in an intellectually honest way, people appreciate that, there's nuance to what you're saying. You're not just ranting, about some policy or something that without any constructive feedback. So, yeah, that has actually improved over time. Any other OB markers, Harish?
Um, I think like generally controversial stuff or anything that can be polarizing, even if it's not politics. For example, international politics. There's a lot of things happening in the world, but that's why sometimes it takes a bit of time to communicate what we do to brands. The best partners we've had are where people within the brands themselves are fan of the podcast, so they understand what we do. And our promise is that we can talk about the most controversial thing, but just like our brand is Yala, but our whole goal is to consider different perspectives, even if it's unpopular. And we don't try to be controversial just for the sake of being controversial. A lot of the times before we start recording, I don't even know how to think about a particular topic. So in some sense, recording the podcast is us wrapping our heads, being able to ask difficult questions in a space that people can actually relate to. So when we talk to brands, we understand the OB markers, but our promise is that we are not going to just go past the OB markers. We're going to toe the line, but we want people to understand why certain things should be said some way, why certain things cannot be said some way.
Understand. I think that's a great point. And, obviously audiences, they're very sophisticated these days, right? And they know if we're kind of dancing around a topic and not getting into the real nuts and bolts. So
Yeah.
it's clear that, what you guys have built is very much based on authenticity, because audiences know when they hear bullshit. So let's dive a little bit further into that. So with podcasting, you obviously can get a lot more intimate with audiences than other mediums. But I'm curious, once that podcast has ended and you've had your views, you've had your engagement, how do you then maintain connection with those audiences across other channels or in other ways?
I mean, like, yeah, Terence, you can go ahead. You can go ahead.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
I mean, one thing. So, I mean, of course, we are on Instagram and TikTok where we take vertical video extracts and upload them there, just to push people to listen. When we started YouTube, the comment section became a lot more vibrant. But I would say the first time our eyes really opened to the power of a podcast connection is when we first started. There was a listener who, I mean, people would message us on social media and we would chat with them. And then one of them actually said, "Oh, we don't only just want to chat with you, we want to chat to other listeners." And we're like, "Okay, how do you suggest we do that?" And they said, "Don't worry, we will help you set up a subreddit." So now they set up a subreddit for us, and now I think there's about 4,000 plus members, and it is, I think, our most active community because every time we post a podcast, people will discuss it. And unlike the comments on TikTok or Instagram, that sometimes can be just one-liners making fun of our appearance or something, people actually write essays on Reddit to either agree, amplify, or totally disagree with what we say, and then other people chime in. So that's one thing that now is kind of self propagating. So on social media, there's one side, and then we also started doing live events. Like literally tonight is our first live event of the year, and thankfully it sold out within a few hours of the tickets going live. So we're trying to just go maintain this community, build it, and try to engage with them in any way possible.
Yeah, I mean,
And
congrats on the live event. I've seen you've had a few of those in the past, and it's obviously working very well for you.
yeah, I just wanted to add as well, like I mean, Yalabat is our flagship show, but we also have created other podcasts, in slightly, different genres, such as scripted narratives, as well as educational podcasts. And a lot of times we actually talk to our audience about the journey of creating these shows. We go behind the scenes a little bit, or we interview people involved in shows. So there's a sense of that they're growing with us as well, the community. We say, you listen to us from the get-go when we started Yellow, but now listen to us, move on to try out different things and experience the joy of audio production alongside us as well. So there's a sense of growing together as a community.
Great. I mean, I love what you guys have said about the community piece, because that's so integral in terms of building niche communities, and that's what brand wants. They want to tap into something that's incredibly relevant to that community. Now, how do you talked a little bit about these Reddit pages that your fans have created, which I think is fantastic that you've got your fans doing that brand building for you. But how do you ensure those pages, those communities don't kind of become an echo chamber for, the same views and thoughts?
I think that's quite interesting because anyone who listens to our podcast, there's I guess there's a little bit of self-selection involved in that they know that they're going to hear a contrarian view. Even we really try to just pose each other questions that really poke holes at whatever view that you think is 100% correct. So people who listen to the podcast, they already come in with that sense of like, okay, I'm here because I want to hear something that I don't agree with. So when they come into the subreddit community, for example, they actually bring that perspective in, and they're actually really civil in terms of how they engage with each other, even if they disagree with each other. And that's one really proud thing, something that we're really proud of, that our community really takes the spirit of Yalla But, and thinking of alternative viewpoints and apply it even in their interactions with each other on an online platform like Reddit.
And I mean, we do have a section at the end of every episode called One Shot Comment, where sometimes, I mean, we just want to highlight a comment that we feel is worth highlighting and could be for various reasons. Sometimes there are a listener from overseas who finds our podcast, keeps them up to date. Sometimes it's someone who really disagrees with us. Sometimes it's someone who shares a view that is opposite to what we feel, but we think, oh, actually, this is a worthwhile thought that everybody needs to hear. And I think it is also something on us that we try our best to do to make sure that we don't actively create an echo chamber. So, for example, one topic that was, I mean, it's been in the news so much is the conflict in the Middle East, with Israel and Hamas. So Minister Shanmugam came on and he shared the government perspective, and we were thinking, okay, that's one perspective, but if we just leave it at that, we're not fulfilling our Yalla But promise. So we found someone who actually is based in the West Bank, a Palestinian, to share the Palestinian point of view. And she shared some stuff that a lot of people were angry about in the comments. But there were also a lot of people in support. And for us, okay, that is us doing our duty to make sure that we try not to create an echo chamber. So anytime we bring someone on who around a contentious issue, we kind of force ourselves, okay, we need to consider the other side. Even when we interview politicians, we want to get people across the board, not just from any one party.
Wow. Yeah, I think that's great. And I think the fact that you guys, make sure that you poke holes in kind of any positioning, and you're looking to balance both sides is a really important role that you guys play here in Singapore as well. So that's great. I'm going to ask Kim a question now, who's joining us from a slightly different view. Obviously, Yalla But is, the content creator side of it. They are podcast hosts. They helm their own podcast. But Kim runs the ad network side of it, where, we have access to hundreds of thousands of podcasts, contextual targeting, that side of things. And Kim, we've had countless conversations about, the power of digital audio and how we feel it's a little bit undervalued in the advertising space. And I'm just going to quote Jeff Green here, the CEO and founder of The Trade Desk. And he says digital audio might be the most on sale corner of the internet. The time spent to ad spend ratio has the highest disparity of any channel, right? So it's clear that while podcast is growing, the ad spend is lagging behind. And I want to understand from your perspective why you think podcast advertising has been undervalued, and how we can convince brands to start thinking about podcasting as part of their marketing mix.
Thanks, Lacey. So my perspective is probably going back a few steps, similar to, from a TV to an online, we're evolving from a radio to a digital audio landscape. So I think a lot of brands are still buying radio advertising, traditional media, and now they're looking to go, okay, cool, what else is next? How is this podcasting going to work for me? So that's, why I basically, left Spotify, which I love dearly, and launched Audacia to be able to give brands and marketers access to a broad range of audio inventory. So I think the biggest barrier to entry for brands is that they might have this really great radio ad that's very energetic and, driving sales and there's, driving people down a funnel, but actually that doesn't translate very well to a podcast environment. If you've got your earphones in, if you're listening to your podcast, walking your dog, you don't really want a shouty ad in your ear. You really need to tone it down and make sure that your audio creative matches the environment. So again, that's where we love to kind of step in and help brands create an audio ad that resonates with a one-to-one user experience, which is usually how consumers listen to a podcast, in their downtime. So
that's really interesting, Kim, because, a lot of the time we've thought, we create a radio ad. Obviously, Mediacorp has, some of the biggest radio stations, radio is still growing as a medium. But the thought that we actually need to change that ad because it's appearing in that one-to-one when you've got your earphones in on your way to work is really interesting. And I haven't heard many brands that are approaching it in this way. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, and just kind of giving them the opportunity to test, the new market. The messaging can be the same. It's just slightly toned down and a little bit more, subtle, if you like. But yeah, I think in an audio landscape in general, looking at the whole landscape, audio is on the rise. Radio is not going anywhere. It's just about maybe tweaking that little message so it kind of is delivered in a different way.
I think, one of the other challenges, I think, both audio, radio, including digital audio face is measurement, right? Because brands might understand the value of the audio space, but for agencies or marketers that have to report up to their MDs, their CEOs about performance, sometimes things like LTR, which is the common measurement for audio listen through rates, just isn't enough for them to justify the spend going. So the question I ask to you is, beyond what some would consider vanity metrics like LTR, how can we drive meaningful business results for brands and prove that the medium is working for them?
Yeah, so there's a couple of ways we can do that. Traditionally, in a radio ad, you could use an offer or a code that you could then take in store or redeem online. So that's probably the most traditional attribution metric is, using a 20% off code or something along those lines. What we're exploring with a couple of different partners at the moment, one's called Magellan AI and one's called Podscribe, is putting pixels within our digital streaming campaigns. So the pixel will go within the campaign itself, and then we'll also put a pixel down on the client's website. So for example, if we're working with a brand that's trying to drive downloads like a bank or maybe a food delivery app like Food Panda, we could track exposure that the user actually listened to the audio ad and then that they downloaded the app and they made a purchase or, deposited cash into that banking app, et cetera, et cetera. So we're really trying to close the loop and bring the best of the best into Singapore and Asia in general on how to run a successful attribution campaign using the best in class tech.
Interesting, Kim. And so it sounds like brands have been pretty receptive to that. And when you offer that kind of attribution measurement, it's a lot easier to kind of get the spends to move over and for them to understand the power of it.
Exactly. If marketers can see a full report with downloads and, and that kind of data, I think it's really impressive. And as you've already mentioned, it's such an underutilized medium. It's not a crowded medium. You're not going to get lost in a sea of display ads, for example, or a sea of, Instagram ads as you're scrolling. You do get at least, 15, most likely 30 seconds with that consumer. It's a one-on-one environment. They've got their AirPods in, they're going about their day, and that's your 30 seconds to really get your message across, drive through what you want, whatever your objective might be, whether it's awareness or sales, and really kind of,
Yeah, I think another part that's interesting, Kim, and you and I have, both being mothers, we've had conversations about like how time poor we are, right? But interestingly, I think some of the studies show that women between the ages of, 25 to 45 are some of the biggest podcast listeners globally. And I can definitely say myself, I listen to a lot of podcasts. You mentioned something to me in a previous chat we had about reaching the unreachables. And I'd just like you to share a little bit more with the audience on that.
Yeah, so the unreachables could be a mother, breastfeeding at 3 a.m. in the morning. Every woman who's on the call or listening would remember that moment. And you can't really hold a book. You don't really want the TV on, but you can put it in, your AirPods in and, listen to a podcast for that 30 minutes that you're dying to get back to sleep for. That could be an unreachable. Another unreachable is maybe, a high-end audience who might not buy that newspaper anymore, but they love listening to the Pivot or Bloomberg on their way to work. And that's how they get their news and entertainment from a global perspective. And then, maybe but they want to, obviously stream on their way home in the afternoon. And that's where you can come in with a host read and really, work with the guys to create a message that's slightly longer than 30 seconds, lean into the brand and, develop, an authentic presence within their podcast to drive home how, you'd like your brand to come across. So there's multiple different ways we can kind of, reach the unreachables, but in general, there is a shift to podcasts and it's such an underutilized medium that now's the perfect time to start testing before it gets too crowded.
I want to dive in a little bit more on what you said about the different options for working within podcasts, right? Because we know that there's so many different ways you can utilize ad inventory around contextual podcasts. So if you're targeting, people with high net worth, you can go into all those financial podcasts, or if you're targeting sports lovers, you can go into all those sports podcasts. And that's obviously a really effective way to reach your target audience at scale. But there's also ways that you can create deeper integration within podcasts. And that is in the form of, sponsorship of the podcast, live reads, perhaps, there's opportunities to get involved with on the ground events, live podcasts as well for brands. So I'm going to throw this one to Haresh and Terence. When you guys are working with brands, how do you decide what's the best way for them to integrate? And for those on the podcast that are interested to work with podcasts like yourself, how do they go about getting in touch with you?
Generally, for the longest time, we have worked with brands in one of two ways. So one is a pre-roll ad, a host-read pre-roll ad, and one is a full episode where we discuss who would be the best guest to bring on to talk about a specific topic. So, it's not too difficult because sometimes it's very campaign-driven, or there's a new launch, or there's an event. So that works a lot better as a pre-roll ad. But if a client comes to us wanting to talk about the new housing policies of Singapore, there's no way a pre-roll ad can do justice to that. So sometimes they come on already asking, okay, can we work with you on a commission episode? Now it's starting to evolve because we're starting to do live events. We are starting to experiment with different things. So that conversation normally starts with them coming on, either asking for our rate card or media kit, having an idea they want pre-roll as a commission podcast, and then after that the discussion is like, okay, what else can we do with you if there is a lot of synergy?
Yes. Okay. Interesting. And I completely agree with what you've said there. I'm going to throw this one to Kim as well, because, how important is frequency when it comes to hearing an ad or a live read within podcasts? Because I'm going to give you one example. What's sitting on my desk today? Can you see this? AG1, Athletic Greens. So I bring this up because all of us that listen to podcasts globally, you'd be living under a rock to not hear an Athletic Greens ad go into a contextual podcast. The frequency is out of this world. So, because of that, I've ended up as a consumer of Athletic Greens as well. And I just wanted to get your perspective on this in terms of frequency, buys, what you can suggest for brands.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think between AG1 and BetterHelp, we've all heard these ads a million times.
Yeah.
And that's the content's created in the US and the impression could have been traded in the US and then it's hard coded. So your ads are still coming through, but you'll find, not that everybody has a VPN, but if you do ever want to explore and put a VPN on, and listen to a UK podcast, you'll hear all the UK ads. So usually you'll hear about 10 ads on average from a British podcast if you're streaming it in Britain. If you're streaming it in Singapore, you won't hear anything usually, unless it's been a host read or it's baked in. So there's a couple of different ways that we're kind of serving the ads out. I suppose, sorry, can we go back to the question again? I've got off track.
Yeah, just in terms of guidance around frequency.
Yeah, okay.
What your suggestions might be.
Yeah, so traditionally in radio, I think there's like a minute of ads per 15 minutes. So that's like 4 minutes, maybe even longer, maybe 10 minutes an hour. I usually say from a frequency perspective, you don't want to serve the ad to the same person more than maybe 2 or 3 times a day. When we're setting up our campaigns, depending on how long it is, for an average campaign, which is 4 weeks long, we probably want to serve that consumer the ad about 8 to 15 times. Depending on if it's a time sensitive offer, what your objective is, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, that's kind of a rough rule that we work with. And then from a listen through rate metric, what you want to kind of be aiming is 80% and up. So we find for our campaigns an average of about 80%, but sometimes they can get all the way up to 98, 99%, which means that the consumers listen, like the majority of those consumers have listened to the whole entire 30-second ad. We can also retarget consumers based on the percentile that they dropped off. So if they dropped off at 50%, we can retarget that user with the ad to try and get them to listen to the whole offer or the whole messaging. So there's some fun digital ways we can kind of reverse engineering it. But yeah, that's kind of the average.
Yeah, really interesting. And I think you called it out, one of the benefits of audio ads and pre-rolls and mid-rolls is, a lot of the time they've got to listen to the entire duration of the ad before they listen to the content. So listen through rates tend to be high, much like video view through rates on in-stream video, which is definitely one of the benefits of audio advertising. Kim, we have got a lot of questions coming in the chat, so I'm going to get to them in a second. So 2 more questions from me before we move to the Q&A. And I'm going to start with Kim on this one. So what's the most common misconception you hear about podcast advertising?
Or that it might be a bit tricky to kind of kickstart. So I think my advice for anyone that wants to dip their toe in, which I think was 62% of the audience, feel free to obviously reach out to Lacey, and we can put together a bit of a strategy for you. I wouldn't go below a $10,000 budget. I'd stick to that. I know sometimes it is a bit tempting to just go, oh, can I just run 5K? I wouldn't bother. Let's stick to a decent 10K test. Lean on Mediacorp and, and your team. And, if there is a host involved, to help you create a piece of audio that resonates, has a great call to action, and drives whatever objective you want to use. Does that kind of...
Yeah, that's great. Haresh, Terence, anything you want to add on common misconceptions about podcast advertising?
Yeah, I think for me, I hear a lot of people asking what's the difference between a podcast and a radio talk show, from the days of the 30s and 40s at BBC and all. And yeah, I think they neglect the intimacy that you can build over the course of a podcast, where we talk really consistently about a certain theme or certain topics, and over a very long period. For us, we're 600 plus episodes into our podcast. And we're always in the ear of our listeners, right? Literally with an AirPods like right next to your ear. So some people even tell us they sleep. Right before they sleep, they actually listen to our podcast because it's something they're just so used to. It's become a habit for them as well. So, not saying that the content makes them sleep, but I think it's just the pacing and our voices. So yeah, there is a much more intimate relationship that the podcast very literally builds with the audience. That it's a bit different from radio. I think the examples earlier of a radio ad, in the middle of walking a dog, that's a great example of how an ad that works for radio wouldn't necessarily work for a podcast.
And if I could just add one thing, one question we do get from brands is like, okay, why would we work with you if you give us like 10,000 listens versus someone who can give us 100,000 views on an Instagram reel? But what we
Mm,
try to communicate with them, because I mean we've been in the short form video space before, but the main difference is for podcast, even for our podcast, I think the completion rate is about 75%, and our podcasts are 1 hour long. So what we
mm,
try to tell a brand, if they're listening to 75%, there is a lot of trust with our podcast. So anything that's host read, I mean, we do try to work with brands that we really resonate with the most. So if we do a host read ad, there's chances that they would absorb it a lot more than,
mm.
let's say, we were to do a YouTube integration. But
Yeah,
to be honest, it's still a bit hard to communicate that because sometimes we understand it is a numbers game. So that's a struggle for us. And I mean, some brands get it, but some maybe people who haven't gotten the bug of podcasts still find it a bit hard to accept.
quality, not quantity, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's a really good point. I mean, I'll add another one because obviously we're working a lot within this space as well. And I think there's still a lot of confusion about what defines exactly what a podcast is, right? Because it started out
Mm,
as an audio medium and it's really evolved now. You know, obviously most of the podcasts, yours included, is video podcast on YouTube. And even YouTube, from a tech perspective, doubling down their strategy on monetizing podcasts. So defining what a podcast is, whether it be audio, bcast, you know, it seems to still be something that brands and advertisers haven't quite wrapped their head around. And Kim and I had a conversation earlier, and I think it's also because it's not really defined. It's continuing to evolve, which we had a chat on.
Yeah, absolutely. It is evolving, which is the most exciting thing about, this industry, is that it's just going to get more and more interesting as we go along. And, as we add new products and we create new products for marketers and brands to explore, that will include video, whether it's a video that they've already got, and we're retargeting a consumer that heard the audio ad, or whether, we want to put a video ad that they've got within a video podcast on YouTube. So this will continue to evolve and it's really exciting space. So yeah, keep on watching and we'll see how the
Yes. Yes, great. Okay, so I am going to move to the Q&A because there is questions coming in. I am going to ask this one. Okay, so we talked a lot about the different podcast formats, live reads, ad inventory, pre-rolls, mid-rolls, sponsorship. One of the questions that has come up is which podcast ad formats are best suited for conversion goals? Kim, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, sure. There's two different ways you can do it in my experience. You can do a 30-second audio ad, place a pixel in there, place a pixel on your website, track exposure and conversion. So that's option A. Option B is to use a host. So you would have a host reading your audio ad. And again, you can pixel that with a Podscribe pixel, and that can give you data back that would include full CPA goals, etc. So there are a lot of kind of options from a conversion perspective.
Interesting. Okay, I'm going to have to get a bit selective because there's a lot of questions coming in here. Okay, so one of the questions I think this is a really interesting one. So do you see brands adopting more podcast advertising? And what is everyone's thoughts on how it will evolve over the next 3 to 5 years? Haresh, Terence, do you guys want to maybe take this one?
Yeah, so I mean the our podcast, we started it 4 years ago, and I mean we fell in love with podcasts years ago, and it just felt like a very exciting format. And we did also see that it felt very similar to how YouTube was back in 2012, 2013 when we were starting, where you get some early adopters, but you get some people just questioning, is this a fad? Is this gonna last? Is it not? But fast forward a few years, and online video content is like a pillar of every brand's marketing. So I think the past few years, podcast growth has been slow, but it's been growing. But the past 6, 7 months, I think it has really grown a lot, which is great for us. And our bet, our hunch is that in a couple of years' time, it will be just another pillar of marketing for every brand out there. I mean, that's our bet. That's why we're doing this. We are continuing to
Yeah.
do this. And I
Yeah.
hope Kim sees the same trends in when she talks to brands as well.
Yeah. I mean, there's the last 6, 7 months, literally, I think, the US presidential elections, a podcast was at the center of, a very big, I would say a string of voters also, in the whole process, right? When Trump appeared on Joe Rogan's podcast and
Yeah.
Kamala Harris didn't. So, and I think in the last couple of months, we've seen Singapore's own Prime Minister Lawrence Wong appear on a couple of podcasts as well. So if there are people making these key decisions that are noticing that podcasts, you can't ignore them for much longer. So I agree with Haresh that, yeah, I know that the last 6, 7 months we've seen like some really rapid adoption from the mass market and all. But at the same time, there's still a lot of room for improvements in the way like how YouTube, when they first introduced being able to tag, only put a timestamp for when you want to send a video to somebody, and then they can immediately click on the timestamp and share that section of the video with them. So there were a lot of tools that YouTube actually took quite a number of years to implement to enable that the community was able to share and enjoy the podcast, enjoy videos and share them with one another. It's only scratching the surface for podcasts right now, whether it's on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or other platforms. And we feel that there's still a lot more growth that can come when people understand the medium and how it fits into their daily consumption of different media types.
Yeah, I love it because you're both saying the same tune in terms of, feeling this real excitement around the podcast inventory and what could be. And, you've captured it great when you talked about, the early days of YouTube, and you look at how successful those people that jumped on that bandwagon early are now. And Kim said it right earlier, talking about the first movers. Does your brand want to be someone that jumps on it now when it's not saturated and can stand out? Or are you going to wait until it's something everyone else is doing, and ultimately the cost of advertising is going to increase incrementally as well? I'm going to ask one question here. Okay, so one's a little bit closer to home, and it's on what are the most popular genres in Singapore when it comes to podcasting, and which genres tend to be the most popular for brands to partner with. Kim, maybe you want to answer this one.
Yeah, I think we were able to dig that out from the Triton slides as well. So that study's definitely been done, and I'm pretty sure that news, business, and entertainment are the three biggest genres. So that's probably where you want to lean into. And from a sponsorship perspective, the biggest demand that I've seen to date is news, current affairs, and finance in Singapore. That's probably where brands want to kind of play with at the moment, and kind of test the waters.
Okay, so there's a lot of questions coming in, and I think it's an interesting one to address about businesses or brands that want to start their own podcasts, but totally have no experience. They don't have the equipment, the hardcore or software needed. And I think it's easy, and Haresh, Terence, do chime in, but I think it's easy to feel like because everyone's got a podcast these days, it's easy to create. But maybe you want to share a little bit about your thoughts in this.
I do think of podcasting more as a marathon than a sprint. Like the traditional way of thinking as a content creator is, I'll make this awesome video, it'll go viral, I'll get 100,000 subscribers. That doesn't work for podcasts. I mean, we always tell people, if you're interested to start a podcast, think of the first 100 episodes that you're going to create. What is the title of each of these 100 episodes? And if you can't come up with 100 episodes, or you don't have the stomach to, complete 100 episodes, then maybe podcasting is going to be a tough one for you, because you really need to be able to, not only find the content, but also keep up the energy level for yourself, in creating content like that. So even for us, having created viral YouTube videos back in the day, and now understanding what a podcast is, it's a very different approach, where we look at it as, we're building a community, and maybe today's podcast might not be as engaging because of the content or whatever, but it's okay. We just keep producing and keep moving on.
Yeah, I think. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry.
Okay.
Just to add, I think one thing we learn also, because just now I mentioned that this is not the first iteration of our podcast. The first iteration of our podcast was very guest centric, and we came from video backgrounds, so we had equipment, equipped our studio, we had the sound, the mic, and after doing 9 or 10 episodes, it did not grow. And we already had a following of about 150, about almost 200,000. The podcast did not grow, and we were like, okay, no one cares. Um, because every like what Terence said, finding a guest scheduling became very tough. And then we just decided to okay, we were looking at the landscape and we saw that news in general was very one-sided. Everything you read was one-sided. So we were like, okay, this is something we wish we had. So let's just try and create something. And the reason why we could foresee doing 100 episodes is because this is what Terence and I talk over lunch every day. Like we'll talk about the news, we'll crack jokes. So we tried it out. And when we got started on it during COVID, we were literally recording in our bedrooms. We had a decent mic, which is not difficult to get, but there was no bling, there was nothing. But I think we were lucky that what we were talking about resonated. And we do see sometimes people invest so much in a studio just to do a limited series of 10 episodes for their company, and we're like, no, just start and try to focus really on the content and the personality of the host.
Yeah.
There's one thing about thought leadership, but then the people you're talking to will be the people who are really looking for that niche. You can still have thought leadership, but if you want to build a podcast, I think the personality is important as well. So, like, I know A16Z, a big VC firm in the US, their podcast is huge because the person who runs the podcast is an employee of the VC firm, but she has a very charismatic personality. And they didn't just get someone to run a podcast as like, okay, you're in marketing, start a podcast.
Mm.
Yeah, so
I think that's great advice. I think that's great advice. And it is, I love what Terence also said about it is a marathon, not a sprint, because even when it's said, even when we talk about our own journey, and there's a very hardworking team behind Executive Insights, which is this series that was created out of COVID. We were all stuck in our homes. How did we, talk about advertising, talk about way brands can connect with advertisers in different ways, and that built over time. And now 4 years down the road, we have successful guests coming on. We have audiences that are very sticky for the content. So slightly different because it's B2B, but I completely understand what you're saying. Okay, I have one question. It's more of a fun question because I'm curious and want to get to know you guys a little bit better. But being that you have your own podcast, you also consume podcasts, I'm sure. Haresh, what is your favorite podcast?
I would say right now, given what's happening in the world, it's a British podcast called The Rest is Politics. And it's by two people who used to be involved in politics in different parties. And I mean, it's quite inspiring for us because they talk about news, they talk about current affairs, they have like 30 years of experience in politics, so a different wealth of experience. But what I like about them is they record anywhere. Like they'll be in their kitchen, they put on a mic and they record. But it's the quality of their conversation that has grown the podcast so much. And now they can sell out like a 13,000 seater stadium. Because it is, and to me, that is the essence of what a podcast is. Two people having a conversation that is honest, that's sincere, and very, very relatable. Yeah. And I think that's also Terrence's favorite podcast, so now he's gonna have to find a different answer.
No, it's okay. It's okay. I've got more. I've got a classic to bring up. I mean, I think a lot of people, just judging from the survey earlier, some have not even listened to podcasts before. I think one podcast that really, was like the start of the second wave of podcasts in the mid 2010s, was the Serial podcast. So there was an investigative journalism podcast hosted by Sarah Koenig, and it just opened my eyes for the possibilities of what podcast could be. An audio adventure could be something that beyond just consuming it and then just going about your life. It's something that actually you felt like you were part of a community, you were part of this group of people in the know about something that other people didn't know. So it built up this community over time, and it was really about a journalist who went dug back into the past archives to dig up news and other little nuggets about a murder case that, was a little suspicious in terms of what happened. And I think he even had like real life effects on the actual case itself, like many years later. So if you want to understand how a podcast can transcend just the audio medium and transcend you, just listening to it while at the gym or doing your laundry or your groceries, I think the Serial podcast is a great example. And it's, it's a limited series, so it's not something that, went on 600 episodes or anything, but it still manages to captivate people. And I always tell people, like, you want to see what the potential of what a podcast can be, you should check that out first.
Love that. I'm going to check that out after this podcast for sure. Kim, how about you?
So mine at the moment is Diary of a CEO. So that's probably, a little bit more of a mixture of content, a lot of interviews. And then my favorite one for a little bit of lighthearted comedy is My Therapist Ghosted Me, which is two comedians that are both Irish, and one of them, their therapist literally ghosted them. So they have like jokes about that, because can you imagine when your therapist ghosts you? It can be quite funny. So that's kind of light and then a little bit more serious. But my advice, if you've never listened to a podcast, is if you're into true crime, like Terence said, start with true crime. True crime, there's so many fantastic stories out there that you can sink your teeth into. And then I've just had a look at like my kind of Apple, podcast app. So it's just the purple one. You can just open it up. I've got all my favorite shows. There's libraries. You can browse through categories. So depending on what your interests are, if you're into sport, if you're into, a specific type of sport, like, football or rugby or cricket or whatever it might be, do a little bit of investigating. Find if you've got like any celebrity shows or sports, players that you're really invested in and you want to learn more about, because so many celebrities have podcasts these days. So that could be a good test podcasting. And the other thing is that we're finding a lot of shows will have follow-up podcasts these days. So pop culture is really leaning into, the podcast movement. So if you love, a specific show from the 90s, there's probably a podcast about it, breaking down each individual episode and having a bit of a laugh about that. So if you are into entertainment, pop culture, sport, and then you've obviously got, your news, business, culture, etc. So, The Economist or Bloomberg, etc. will be there. And obviously you've all got to have a listen to Yeah La But, because that's going to be on our playlist moving forward, I'm sure.
So something for everyone, it sounds like, depending on your interests. And, you mentioned Stephen Bartlett, also one of my favorites. And I will say one thing that I love about his podcast is the marketing trailers and teasers. He nails that across TikTok and IG and makes you want to watch the entire episode. So that's one of my favorites. Also, I'm a shameless plug, because CNA podcasts, obviously we have a wide variety of podcasts across different issues such as health, finance, work, and they're very, very interesting and on point. I'm going to close up today, but before I do, if you found this session exciting about the world of podcasts, you've learned, how you can get started, how you can perhaps build your own podcast, but also leverage off existing podcasts such as Yalla But, or buy into inventory with Audacia, I want to share a little bit more about Mediacorp's current products in this space. Chai Feng, if you could just roll the screen for me. Okay, so at Mediacorp, we do have a product called the Audio Exchange, and this is powered by Audacia with Kim today. So what we've developed is an audio network where you can buy inventory across contextually relevant podcasts from CNA Podcasts, Condé Nast, BBC, and TED, all with one streamlined and frequency capped buy. So this is really exciting for brands really wanting to get into the premium podcast space and deliver one easy buy. The second product, which I want to touch on, is something that we've just launched a month ago called Live Reads. And we're going to play a short video for you. But basically, to explain Live Reads is, a lot of you might have already been doing open talk on radio. Now, Live Reads is basically the next iteration of live open talk on radio. It allows you to get your message into one of our podcasts at scale across many, many podcasts on our YouTube platforms. So I'm going to play a quick video for you now. Okay, so please do reach out to your account managers if you want some more information on our products. Also, you can reach out to Haresh and Terence if you'd like to talk more about how you can work with their podcasts, and Kim as well if you're looking at regional and global buys with the Audacia network. I want to thank my panelists today, Haresh, Terence, Kim. It's been fantastic.
Thank you so much. And just a little plug, you can reach us on Instagram, Yalabat, or email us at contact@ministryofunny.com, which is our comedy brand. So that's the easiest way to reach us. Pardon the shameless plug.
Or attend the event tonight.
Oh, yes,
Oh,
but
yeah,
we
yeah.
sold out, so it has to be the next event.
When is the next event?
Probably in a couple of months' time. And I mean, we're trying to do a bigger venue. I mean, at some point, we want to do a 24-hour podcast marathon where Terence and I record for 24 hours with 24 guests over 24 episodes. So
Amazing.
I mean, that's why we're trying to do stuff like that. And if any brands are interested in doing stuff like that, that brings the podcasts and audio to the streets, we definitely want to chat.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, Terence. Thank you, Haresh. Thank you, Kim. I appreciate all your expert advice today. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. Have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.